Her frozen hand, a desperate claw in a waterlogged wool glove, was slipping. Each frantic scrape against the jagged edge of the ice was a losing battle, the rough crystals tearing at the fabric, her numbed fingers failing. Below her, the dark, frigid water of Blackwood Pond pulled with eager, terrifying strength. The ice itself, a vast, winterlocked sheet just moments before, groaned a deep, resonant protest, then shattered again with a sickening crack, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the frozen air. Agnes Periwinkle gasped, a mouthful of icy water choking her, and she was going under. The world above, the pale sky, the stark winter trees, began to tilt and fade. This was it. But as the blackness encroached, a massive, muddy work boot slammed down onto cracking ice just inches from her submerged head, followed by a rough, powerful voice that cut to the roar of her terror. "Hold on. I see you. Don't you dare give up." Agnes Periwinkle, 78 years of quiet dignity and steadfast New England resilience, had always found solace by Blackwood Pond. Her cozy cottage, nestled amongst whispering pines, overlooked its ever-changing face, a view her late husband, Arthur, had declared the finest in Harmony Creek. Her daily walks along its perimeter were a cherished ritual, a moving meditation, especially in winter when the world was hushed and cloaked in white. She was a retired schoolteacher, her mind still sharp, her spirit independent, though the winter seemed to bite a little harder each year, and the tasks Arthur once handled now fell solely to her. She knew her limits, or so she thought, prided herself on her careful nature, her ability to manage alone. The pond in winter was a thing of stark beauty, but also a silent, waiting danger she'd always respected from a safe distance. Across the frozen expanse, where the skeletal frame of the old Blackwood mill was slowly being resurrected, Mack Riley wiped a smear of grease from his cheek with the back of a gloved hand. Early 40s. Built like the foundations he poured, Mack was the foreman of the construction crew. His face, whether by years of outdoor work and etched with permanent squint against sun and sawdust, rarely betrayed the thoughts that churned beneath his stoic surface. His hands, callous and powerful, were tools in themselves, capable of both brute force and surprising finesse. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of inherent capability, and a life lived dealing with the tangible, the real, under his heavy Carhartt jacket. The faded outline an Army Corps of Engineers insignia might have been discernible on a warmer day, a testament to a past where precision and managing risk were paramount. Mack carried a quiet weight, an unspoken memory of a different kind of water, a swift-moving river years ago, and a tragedy he couldn't prevent. It wasn't guilt, not exactly, but a deeply ingrained sense of responsibility, a vow silently renewed each morning that if he could help, he would. It made him meticulous, observant, a man who noticed the slightest change in the tension of a cable or the faintest tremor in uncertain ground. His crew respected him for his fairness, his unwavering calm under pressure, and the unspoken assurance that he always had their backs. Today, the air was so cold it felt brittle, the kind of cold that found its way into your bones no matter how many layers you wore. The cold snap had been relentless, locking Harmony Creek in an iron grip. Blackwood Pond was a solid, glittering shield of ice, or so it appeared. Agnes, bundled in her warmest coat, her favorite red scarf a cheerful slash of color against a monochrome landscape, had been drawn by a flash of vibrant blue near the reeds at the pond's southern edge, a blue jay, bold and beautiful against the snow. She'd only meant to get a slightly better look, to perhaps scatter the last of the birdseed from her pocket. She knew the rules. Stay off the ice unless it was declared officially safe, and even then, stick to the well-trodden paths. But the jay was so captivating, and the ice right at the very edge, where the reeds poked through, looked so thick, almost like an extension of the frosted bank. Surely, just a few steps wouldn't hurt. The snow crunched reassuringly under her boots as she left the path. She took one step onto the ice, then another, her gaze fixed on a bird. It felt solid, deceptively solid, The first warning was a sound like a muffled gunshot from beneath her feet, a low, sickening groan that vibrated up through the soles of her boots. Alarm, sharp and cold, lanced through Agnes. She froze, realizing her folly. She tried to retreat, to take a slow, careful step back toward the bank. But that small shift in weight was all it took. With a crack that ripped through the frozen silence like a tearing fabric, the world dropped out from under her. One moment, she was standing on what felt like stone. The next, she was enveloped in water so breathtakingly, paralyzingly cold it felt like being stabbed by 1,000 icy needles. The shock stole her breath, her voice, her ability to think. Her heavy winter coat became an anchor, dragging her down. Instinct, raw and desperate, made her flail, her arms windmilling, her gloved hands searching for purchase, for anything solid in the churning, freezing chaos. Her initial cry was a strangled gasp, swallowed by the icy water that surged up around her, seeking to claim her. Mack Riley was overseeing the unloading of steel beams, the clang and grind of machinery, a familiar symphony. He paused, his head cocked, that internal alarm system, honed by years of vigilance, suddenly blaring. It wasn't a sound from the worksite. It was something else, something unnatural. A splash, a muffled shout, distorted by the distance and the baffling effect of the frozen landscape. It was hard to pinpoint, but it was enough. "Hold up a sec, boys," he called out, his voice cutting through the noise. He scanned the area, his gaze sweeping across the dormant fields, the treeline, and then, inevitably, toward the vast, white expanse of Blackwood Pond. His heart gave a sudden, hard thump. There, a dark patch on the ice near the far southern edge. Something struggling, a flurry of movement. It was too far to see clearly, but he knew, with a chilling certainty, what it was. "Danny, call 911. Now, someone's in the pond, south side." Mac's voice was a whip crack, galvanizing his young apprentice into action. He didn't wait to see if Danny complied. He knew his crew. He was already moving, his mind racing, assessing. Direct approach was suicide on compromised ice. He needed something to distribute his weight. His eyes landed on a stack of heavy-duty laminated veneer lumber planks, long, wide, and strong, left over from shoring up a section of the old mill. Perfect. He seized the longest one, a 12-footer, its weight significant but manageable in his adrenaline-fueled state. His boots pounded the frozen, uneven ground as he sprinted toward the pond's edge, the shouts of his crew fading behind him. "Hang on! I'm coming!" he roared, hoping his voice would carry, a beacon of sound across the desolate ice. "Try to keep your arms spread on the ice. Don't fight it." He knew the victim would be panicking, expending precious energy. Agnes heard it, a voice, deep and powerful, slicing to the fog of her terror and the insidious, creeping numbness. A man's voice, hope, a tiny, flickering candle in the overwhelming darkness, flared within her. She was so cold. Her limbs were heavy, unresponsive. The water was a living thing, pulling her down, its icy tendrils coiling around her. She tried to obey, tried to spread her arms on the jagged edges of the hole, but her waterlogged coat fought her, and her fingers, clumsy and frozen, kept slipping. Each wave of frigid water that washed over her seemed to suck more life away. Mack reached the bank, his chest heaving. He could see her clearly now, an elderly woman, her face ashen, her eyes wide with a terror that mirrored the frozen hell she was trapped in. Her struggles were becoming weaker, more sporadic. He didn't hesitate. He dropped to his knees, shoving the heavy plank out in front of him, testing its purchase on the groaning, protesting ice. He lay flat, his considerable weight spread as much as possible, and began the agonizingly slow crawl, pushing the plank ahead, then pulling himself forward. The ice beneath him creaked and snapped, a terrifying soundtrack to his desperate mission. He could feel its instability, the way it sagged slightly under the plank. One wrong move, one area too thin, and he'd be in there with her. The thought, instead of paralyzing him, sharpened his focus. He remembered the river, the faces. Not again. That silent vow echoed in the chambers of his heart. He was a builder, a problem solver. This was just another, more lethal problem to solve. "Ma'am, can you hear me? Look at me," he yelled, his voice strained with the effort of his prone crawl. "Keep looking at me. Help is coming, but you gotta hold on for me." Agnes's head lolled. Her vision was blurring. The voice was a distant anchor, but the cold was a seductive siren, promising peace, an end to the struggle, the pain. Her left hand, the one still desperately hooked onto a fragile shard of ice, suddenly lost its grip. The sodden wool gave way. Her body, already mostly submerged, plunged deeper. Icy water surged over her head, into her gasping mouth, down her throat. A strangled, gurgling cry. And then she was under, the pale winter light vanishing into a terrifying, silent, green-black void. No! Mack's roar was primal, a denial of what he was witnessing. He surged forward, shoving the plank with a desperate burst of strength, heedless of the sharp cracks that now radiated all around him like a spider's web. He saw her bob back to the surface, a ghost in the churning water, choking, sputtering, her eyes vacant, the fight almost entirely extinguished. She was going. He was losing her. The plank, for all its length, was still heartbreakingly sure of her position. The ice directly around the hole she'd made was a treacherous, shattered mess of floating shards and dark, beckoning water. To reach her now meant abandoning the relative security of the plank, to commit his full weight to the dangerously compromised ice. He could feel the numbing cold seeping through his own thick-work clothes where his chest and legs pressed against the frozen surface. A violent tremor ran through him, born of cold, exertion, and the chilling echo of past failure. He clenched his jaw so hard it ached, banishing the ghosts. This time will be different. Almost there, ma'am. Just a little more. "You gotta fight," he gritted out, his gaze locked on her, willing her to stay conscious, to find one last spark. He could see the faint, almost imperceptible flutter of her pulse at the side of her neck. She was still there. He slid off the end of the plank, his body now fully on the treacherous ice itself. It groaned loudly, like a dying beast, and a large, jagged crack shot out from directly beneath his chest. His left boot suddenly punched through a thinner, unseen patch. The shocking, brutal cold of Blackwood Pond flooded his boot, surging up his leg to his knee, a pain so intense it stole his breath for a second. He gasped, a sharp, involuntary intake of frigid air, but his eyes never left Agnes. His focus was absolute. The distant wail of sirens was growing louder, a mournful song carried on the biting wind, joined by the anxious shouts of his crew, who had gathered helplessly at the bank. They had ropes, blankets, but they couldn't reach her. Only he could. Mack knew it was all on him. In these few critical seconds, he was her only lifeline. He extended his right hand, his arm stretched to its absolute limit, his fingers splayed, reaching, straining through the biting air towards her. "Grab my hand," he commanded, his voice raw with urgency and effort. "You have to reach. Grab my hand now." Through the deepening haze, Agnes saw it, a hand, large, gloved, calloused even to material, impossibly far yet undeniably there. A point of focus in a swirling, freezing nightmare. With a surge of what she didn't know she possessed, a primal instinct to live overriding the cold's deadly lullaby, she tried to lift her arm. It felt like it was made of lead, encased in concrete. Her fingers, stiff and unresponsive as frozen twigs, moved feebly, twitching in the icy water. "Now! Reach for me!" Mack urged, his voice a lifeline of pure, concentrated will. He shifted his weight, a dangerous gamble, inching precariously closer. He could almost feel the deadening drag of the water on her heavy, soaked clothing, the profound, life-sapping chill radiating from her small form. Then, a miracle of contact. Her icy, barely moving fingers brushed against his. He lunged, a desperate, powerful movement, and his own gloved hand closed around her wrist like a band of steel. His grip was absolute, fueled by adrenaline and an unbreakable, defiant resolve. "I've got you," he yelled, the words torn from his chest, a roar of triumph and determination against the encroaching darkness. "I will not let go." This was the precipice. The jaw-dropping rescue wasn't going to be a clean lift, no Hollywood moment. It was going to be a brutal, ugly, desperate war against the cold, against the water, against the failing strength in Agnes's small frame. He planted his boots as best he could on the treacherous, shifting surface, ignoring the agonizing, numbing cold that now engulfed his entire left leg, and he pulled. Agnes was a dead weight, the waterlogged clothes making her impossibly heavy, the current seeming to fight him, to pull her back into its deadly embrace. The ice around them screamed in protest, great cracked spider webbing outwards in all directions, entire sections tilting and threatening to give way completely under their combined weight. Mack gritted his teeth, every muscle in his body coiled and straining, his face a mask of raw effort, sweat freezing on his brow despite the bitter cold. He pulled, then braced himself, digging his right heel into a slightly thicker section of ice, then pulled again, gaining a precious inch. Agnes, barely conscious, could only offer the passive resistance of her inert body. He was her anchor, her only connection to the living world. He could feel the ice shifting violently beneath him, a terrifyingly unstable platform. A large piece near his right knee suddenly broke away with a sickening crack and splash, and he had to adjust his stance instantly, his body twisting, nearly losing his balance, nearly being pulled at himself. But his grip on Agnes's wrist, that small, fragile connection, never faltered. He wouldn't let her go. He couldn't. The ghosts of the past were screaming at him, but his resolve screamed louder. He was dragging her now, an inch at a painful time, across the jagged, splintering surface, back towards a slightly more stable area near where he'd had to abandon the plank, back towards a distant shore. It was a brutal, agonizingly slow retreat from the jaws of death. His lungs burned for air, his arms and back screamed in protest. The cold of his submerged leg was a relentless, gnawing agony that threatened to paralyze him. But he kept going. He thought of his own children, their laughter, their trusting faces. He thought of the quiet strength of his wife, Sarah. He thought of the men on his crew, watching from the shore, their faith in him unspoken but palpable. He thought of the precious, fragile life he held so tenaciously in his grasp. And he thought of that shadow from his past, the one he was finally, definitively, wrestling into submission with every heave, every inch gained. He could hear the shouts from the shore, clearly now, closer, more urgent. His crew, and the first flashing red and blue lights of the paramedics and fire rescue vehicles bouncing across the uneven ground. They were there at the very edge of the pond, fanning out, ready with ropes, with blankets, with outstretched hands. That sight, that tangible sign of imminent support, ignited a renewed surge of power within him, the last reserves of strength he didn't know he had. One last monumental effort. With a guttural cry that tore from his throat, he pulled Agnes clear of the main break, onto a larger, more intact section of ice just feet from the bank. Then, strong hands were reaching for them both, voices offering encouragement, urgent instructions. Together, a chain of human effort, they hauled Agnes, then Mack, onto the blessed, unyielding solidity of the snow-covered ground. Relief, so potent it was dizzying, washed over Mack in a tidal wave, nearly buckling his knees. He was soaked to the bone, shivering uncontrollably, his left leg a block of agonizing, throbbing ice, but he barely registered his own profound discomfort. His eyes, his entire focus, were fixed on Agnes. She was alive. Her skin was a ghostly, bluish white. She was shivering violently enough to rattle her teeth, her breath shallow and ragged, but she was alive. Paramedics were instantly at her side, a whirlwind of efficient, compassionate action, expertly cutting away her sodden clothes, wrapping her in thick thermal blankets, their voices calm and reassuring. Max stumbled toward her, shrugging off his own soaked, heavy jacket. It was useless now, and instinctively tried to help cover her further, his hands clumsy and shaking with cold and exhaustion. one of the paramedics, a young woman with steady, kind eyes, put a gentle but firm hand on his arm. "We've got her, sir. You did an incredible thing. Now we need to take care of you. You're hypothermic." Mack just shook his head, his teeth chattering too hard to form coherent words. Hero? He'd just seen someone in trouble and reacted. He watched, his heart still pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, as they carefully lifted Agnes onto a stretcher. Her eyelids fluttered open. Her eyes, slitted against the harsh winter light and the fog of near-death, found his. They were no longer wide with terror, but filled with a dawning awareness, a profound, silent gratitude that resonated deeper than any spoken accolade could. As they began to carry her toward the warmth and safety of the waiting ambulance, she managed to lift a trembling, blue-tinged hand, a tiny, almost imperceptible wave. Her lips, cracked and pale, formed a sound, a whisper lost of wind but heard by his heart. Angel, his crew surrounded him then, thumping him on the back, their faces etched with a mixture of awe, relief, and profound respect. Danny, his young apprentice, just stared, his mouth slightly agape, eyes shining. "Mack, I've never seen anything like that in my whole life. You walked on water, almost. You saved her life." "Cold." Mack managed to stammer, a weak, shivering attempt to deflect the rising tide of praise. He allowed himself to be guided, half-supported, towards another ambulance. A coarse, wonderfully warm blanket was draped over his shoulders. He could feel the curious, amazed stares of the small crowd of local townsfolk that had gathered, drawn by the sirens and the unfolding life-or-death drama at their placid pond. Their hushed voices, their expressions of open admiration, barely registered. All he could think about was the fragile warmth he'd eventually felt in Agnes's small wrist through his glove, the faint, stubborn flutter of her pulse against his fingertips, the undeniable victory against the brutal, indifferent ice. Later, after being thoroughly checked over at Harmony Creek General, moderate hypothermia, some impressive bruises, but miraculously nothing broken or permanently damaged, Mack learned that Agnes Periwinkle was stable. She was going to make a full recovery. The news settled a quiet, profound peace in him, a warmth that had nothing to do with the hospital blankets or the lukewarm coffee he was sipping. He politely but firmly deflected the eager questions from a local news reporter, gave a brief, factual statement to sheriff, and then, dressed in dry, borrowed clothes that felt strange on his skin, he simply went home to Sarah and the kids. The jaw-dropping rescue at Blackwood Pond, as the Harmony Creek Herald would sensationally headline it the next day, was, for Mack Riley, just a Tuesday afternoon where the ordinary had collided with the extraordinary, and where he'd been given the chance to answer a call he hadn't known was coming. In the days and weeks that followed, Harmony Creek buzzed with the story. Mack Riley's name was on everyone's lips, spoken with a new kind of reverence, though he did his level best to avoid the limelight, returning to the clamor and dust of the Blackwood Mill project, as if nothing more remarkable than a delayed concrete pour had occurred. He did, however, arrange for a large, cheerful bouquet of resilient yellow chrysanthemums to be sent to Agnes's hospital room, with a simple card that read, "Wishing you a speedy recovery, from a friend." Agnes, of course, knew instantly who her friend was. When Agnes was well enough and back in her own cozy cottage, she insisted on a visit, not to the noisy construction site, where she knew Mack would be uncomfortable with any fuss, but she invited him for tea and her famous blueberry scones, a proper, heartfelt thank you. Mack, a man far more comfortable with blueprints and bulldozers than doilies and delicate china, found himself surprisingly at ease in her warm, sunlit kitchen. He listened, genuinely interested, as she spoke of her late Arthur, of her years shaping young minds as a teacher, of the specific antics of the blue jay that had inadvertently led to her misadventure. She didn't gush, didn't shower him with effusive praise. She simply looked him directly in the eye, her own gaze clear and bright with restored life, and said, her voice steady and full of emotion, "Mark Riley, you are a good man, a brave man. You didn't just save my life. You're reminded an old woman that there are still giants walking among us. For Mack, those simple, sincere words, spoken from the heart in the quiet intimacy of her kitchen, meant more than any medal or public accolade ever could. That old shadow from his past, the one that had flickered so menacingly when he first saw Agnes struggling in the icy water, felt different now. Lighter, not entirely erased, perhaps. Some memories become part of the bedrock of who you are, but no longer a source of deep-seated ache or quiet regret. He had faced the water again, faced the fear, faced the specter of helplessness, and this time he had prevailed. He had been strong enough. He had been fast enough. He had been enough. The story of Mack Riley and Agnes Periwinkle became woven into the fabric of Harmony Creek, a quiet legend told on cold winter nights, a powerful reminder that heroes don't always wear shining armor or carry shields. Sometimes they wear faded Carhartt jackets and steel-toed work boots. Sometimes they are the quiet, steady hands that build our communities, the everyday Americans who, when thrust unexpectedly into the crucible of crisis, draw upon an inner wellspring of courage, compassion, and an unshakable sense of duty to their fellow human beings. Mack Riley never saw himself as a hero. He was, in his own estimation, just a man who did his job, a man who believed in looking out for his neighbors, a man who understood, perhaps better than most, that the true, enduring strength of a nation lies not in its grand pronouncements or its formidable might, but in the character of its people. It resides in a quiet courage that steps forward when danger rears its head, in the resilience that rebuilds and renews hope from the ashes of despair, in the simple, yet profoundly impactful acts of selflessness that bind us together as a community, as a people, as Americans. Agnes Periwinkle continued her daily walks by Blackwood Pond. Her heart overflowed with quiet, abiding gratitude. Her gaze would often drift across the water toward the rising silhouette of the old mill, where the rhythmic clang of hammers and the whine of saws were no longer just industrial noise, but a comforting, reassuring symphony, a daily reminder of the extraordinary day an ordinary American construction worker had shown the true, unyielding, and deeply inspiring measure of the human spirit. And in that spirit, she knew, as did everyone in Harmony Creek who heard the tale, there was always hope, always strength, and always a bright, unwavering promise of another sunrise over a land built by and for the brave.